Yes, it's being called the Horn of Africa's most catastrophic drought in a generation, one that's now sparked calls for an emergency conference to take place next Monday in Rome under the auspices of the World Food Programme. Up to 12 million people in need of food aid, with, for instance, the world's largest refugee camp in Dadaab, Kenya, bursting at the seams as it's now home to some 400,000 Somalis. We're going to look at the severity of the current drought, but also ask, why is it that more than a quarter century after those Live Aid concerts for Ethiopia, 2 decades after the start of Somalia's civil war, why is it so many people are still vulnerable to starvation there? Today in the France 24 debate, we're going to be discussing hunger in the Horn of Africa. And with it to talk about it with us in a moment, we'll have David Orr of the World Food Programme, spokesperson for East and Southern Africa in Nairobi. With us in the studio, François Danel, Executive Director of aid group Action Against Hunger. Thank you for being with us. François Ndengwe, founder of the African Advisory Board. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
And we hope to be joined from London shortly by Jonathan Glennie, author of The Trouble with Aid, Why Less Could Mean More for Africa. And from Conakry, Emmanuel Goujon, until recently Addis Ababa bureau chief for the French news agency AFP, now working as a consultant for Africa Global Approach. Thank you for being with us there from West Africa. The France 24 debate, which you can follow on Facebook, and you can also catch up with our guests on Twitter, where our handle is @FrancoisF24. Now, just to begin and to set the scene a little bit, this story, this unfolding story, has barely been a blip on the radar screen here in Europe. But over in East Africa, 2 years of persistent drought, everyone's seen it coming. And let's face it, they've been braced for the worst. Take a look.
Streams of refugees in search of water and food for their families. They've been driven from their homes by the worst drought in the region for 6 decades. Barely a drop of rain has fallen in 2 years, causing plants and livestock to wither and die.
We used to have drought every 10 years, then it became every 5 years, now it's every 2 years. And if you don't have the rains at the beginning of the year or towards the end of one year, then you're going to have a problem into the next year.
Now millions of people are living on the brink of starvation. But NGOs say it doesn't have to be this way, and that governments should anticipate food shortages rather than just repair the damage.
We need to do much more, especially in disaster risk reduction. We need to make disaster risk reduction a political priority and invest accordingly, because these scenes we should never see again. The reality is drought will continue to be with us, but we need to do much more, much sooner.
There are many simple solutions. NGOs suggest forcing farmers to reduce their herd size, thereby pushing them to sell their animals earlier in the year and diversify. They say improving access to water and infrastructure is also vital. But the onus falls on governments to invest in these preventative measures.
There is a need for investment, big investment in agriculture, the livestock sector, the crop sector. And that is need to be sustained. It is not a one-off issue.
David Orr in Nairobi, before we talk about food policy, let's get our numbers straight. Is it the worst drought in decades, or as you heard in that report, some say even 60 years?
It's certainly, according to many analysts and meteorologists, it's certainly the driest. It has certainly been the driest year in 60 years in many parts of the region. Whether it's the worst drought depends slightly on how you measure a drought in terms of meteorology, its impact on those affected and so on. At the height of the drought in 2007, 2009, for example, we had as many as 22 million people in the region affected. At the moment, we're looking at maybe 11 million people affected, but that's expected to rise. And then you've got to consider all the other factors like the severity of the drought and its fallout. We're seeing very high levels of malnutrition amongst children, for example. So this business of, is it the worst, comparing it to previous droughts. In a way, I'm not sure how far it takes us, given that we have to address the needs of the people first and foremost.
François Danel, in the report, we heard that spokeswoman for the UN say it used to be every 10 years, then every 5 years, now it's every 2 years. What do you think of that statement?
But it's true that we are facing more and more drought in all this type of country, including the Sahel part of Africa, in the west part of Africa. And what is sure is that we have to prevent this type of catastrophe. And now the catastrophe is there, we have to face it, and we have to deal with all these children suffering from acute malnutrition. And this is the case for our centers in Nairobi, not in Nairobi, in Mogadishu, in Wajid, in Somalia, where many children are coming, and something like 80% of them are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, with the worst type of malnutrition that we can face for children.
I was going to say, you were telling me that Action Against Hunger has been in Somalia for 2 decades now. Is it the worst you've seen?
Yes, or maybe we could compare it to the 92 situation, where it was really, really tough in 92. But since 92, we haven't seen such a famine and such a crisis.
All right. Now, the UN Refugee Agency says that Somalis are crossing the border by the hundreds, sometimes the thousands every day into Kenya and Ethiopia. We can see, for instance, at the Dalau camp, families describe having walked for days.
aroortii ayaa halkaas dumarka laga qabtay aad nabray waxba ay qabtay anuu 6 biloodan jooga oo waxa iga soo dhacay taswiirtii wiil waxaan nooloo intaan leego taswiirtii laho indii loo uumayo diskile wixii waa loo uumay baa iga soo dhacay.
All right, so there, again, I want to get back to David Orr in Nairobi. When it comes to the sheer numbers of people who are escaping from Somalia, what can you tell us?
We have seen approximately 2,000 people per day coming from Somalia into the refugee camps at Doloado in Ethiopia. Coming into the camps at Dadaab in northeastern Kenya, approximately 1,300, maybe more than that, as many as 1,500 per day. And it's been like that during recent weeks. The number has just continued to rise. I've been at the camps in Dadaab. I've seen long lines of refugees streaming down the road through this desert landscape towards the camps. They've been traveling for days, for weeks in some cases, with children towards the camps to get assistance there from the UN agencies.
Now, less than 2 weeks ago, Somalia's Shabaab militias lifted a 2-year ban on Western aid agencies entering areas that they control. Emmanuel Goujon, those Islamist militias usually don't take kindly to strangers. What does this say, the fact that they're letting them in now?
Well, I think the important sign from the Al-Shabaab to accept this humanitarian aid into Somalia in the area they control is a sign of the gravity of the situation on the ground, and of the fact that nobody on the ground is able to face alone this big hunger crisis. Again, there's been a lot of droughts, but also you have to understand that this situation of hunger, this crisis, humanitarian crisis, is also due to the disruption of all the networks for food distribution, traditional ones and humanitarian ones, for more than 20 years in Somalia. And for the last decade, a lot of people have had to move from fighting areas in order to save their life, to live in other areas where they don't have a house most of the time, where they're in kind of refugee camps or displaced people camps, and where they hardly find food. And as there was no access for the NGOs, most of them, inside Somalia, in fact, the food situation has worsened. Also, this security situation is a problem in Ogaden region in Ethiopia itself, bordering Somalia. So all these factors, in fact, worsen the whole food situation and food security in the Horn of Africa.
Which, François Ndengwe, brings us to an important point. There's Mother Nature, there's the fact that there is the climate, and what Emmanuel Goujon was just saying, there's the security situation.
Yes, and when we're facing a catastrophe like this, a disaster like this, we have to see that if it occurs one time, we will say it's the nature's fault. Twice, it's a natural fault. But when you have a repetition, we are forced to see that it's also a human-made disasters. You have the case of Somalia, the security disaster there. No government for decades, no people organizing, no organizations. To feed people, you need agriculture, you need production, you need distribution, and you need storage. If you have nothing of this, people have been fighting. So I think this is, to a certain point, a man-made disaster. And if we have to solve this type of solution, we can, of course, we need emergency aid to the people who are suffering and the women who are suffering here. But we have to think thoroughly on how to solve the basic problems at the roots of this. We will have drought. You cannot avoid it. But if you have a government who have a working policies, it's possible to tackle all these problems.
And on its editorial page this Monday, the Daily Telegraph highlights that fluctuations in the climate are beyond human control, but their effects magnified by lack of development in the areas worst hit, and in the case of Somalia, by the violent anarchy which has plagued the country over the past 20 years. Jonathan Glennie in London, do you agree with Francois Ndengwe that what we're witnessing is a man-made disaster?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I was about to say I agree with everything he said. He put it very well. I mean, what I'd quite like to say, though, is that unfortunately for viewers of this programme, a lot of people I know in my country, in the UK, they're going to be watching this and they're going to be thinking, not again, here we go again. Everything's a disaster in Africa. This is an absolute disaster, what we're watching at the moment, but it's not typical of what's going on in Africa at the moment and what's been happening in the last 10 years. And I think that's an important point to raise, because there certainly have been disasters of this kind in other parts of Africa in the past. And what we've seen in the last decade is quite an improvement in the situation of a lot of African people, including the poorest. So there is hope, but this is absolutely, as Francois said, it's a disaster, precipitated by nature, but human beings should be able to deal with it.
As a result, when you hear the remarks there by Jonathan Glennie, Francois Danel, is there donor fatigue? People who are saying, "Oh no, not again." When it comes to Africa, is it difficult to fundraise, to raise awareness?
No, we could face that, but I think there is still hope, because we know how to treat these children, and it's very efficient, and we can really save these kids. But it's true that the root problem is a human problem, and it's not a natural disaster, and that's difficult, because for Somalia it has taken years and years, and it's still the same problem, and for years and years it's still the same problem. So there is a bit discouragement for that.
Did you think 20 years ago, when you went to Somalia, that it would still be in the situation it's in today?
No, honestly, no. But the real solution is a political solution, and it's very, very difficult to set up in Somalia, because there are these clanic problems which have been taking place for years and years, and it's difficult to find a solution.
Emmanuel Goujon, when you see that the West is experiencing fatigue after simply 4 months in Libya, when you look at the situation in Somalia, is it now inevitable that there will always be a security situation like that?
No, I don't think it's inevitable at all. I think, in fact, it's a question of policies. I mean, emergency food aid is necessary in case of emergency, but it's only to cure the symptom of a bigger crisis, which is food security in the whole region. In some stable countries, even not democratic, absolutely democratic, but at least stable and more secure, like Ethiopia, for example, safety net programs have been put in place in order to prevent that kind of situation to happen. We are not anymore like in the 80s under the Mengistu in Ethiopia, and now the government is monitoring very efficiently every year, every month, what is really happening regarding the crops. regarding the level of water, of rains, and so on, in order to control and to prevent that kind of humanitarian crisis. So one of the main aspects of the whole problem is to prevent that kind of humanitarian crisis. And it's only possible in states or in countries which are stable and where there is security. But the West has also a part to play in order to help these countries to implement new programs in order to have a real food security in this area.
When you look at the situation in Somalia, David Orr, it's difficult if you don't have a proper state apparatus with which to talk. Are there ways in a society that's more clan-based than rather having a centralized government? Are there ways to do the things that Emmanuel Goujon was talking about?
Well, I've been in Somalia this year, in the central parts, in Galkayo and Garowe, and we traveled around and talked with local leaders. I mean, there are absolutely ways of operating in there, but it's as your contributors have said, when things fall apart and there's conflict, it's absolutely incredibly difficult to implement any sort of program or operation that's going to help the people at large. I mean, we are operating in there. We're operating in the transitional government-controlled areas around Mogadishu, in the central parts, in the north. It's not the whole of Somalia that's as broken and shattered as the south. I mean, that has to be said. You know, it's not a totally hopeless case, but at the moment, it's this dreadful combination of conflict, of drought, of high food prices. It's that have conspired to really wreak havoc on people who are already terribly, terribly vulnerable and recovering from the 2007-2009 drought. And I think that's the point. There are some elements over which we have control, others that really we don't and that were unforeseen.
Very briefly, Jonathan Glennie, before we go to the break, Somalia, a pastoral society to a certain degree. Over the past 2 decades, even though there is no central government that controls the whole country, could more have been done to do what they call disaster risk reduction?
Well, that's the phrase of the moment. I'm afraid you're asking someone who's not a Somalia expert. You've probably got people on your panel who may be able to answer that better. But I think one of the major changes that we've seen in the last 10 years, and it's really quite important, is that donors and outsiders are beginning to be slightly less arrogant in what they think is the answer. And they're listening more to some of the solutions that are emerging in countries like Somalia and Ethiopia. And I think that in that there lies some hope.
All right. Well, when we come back, we're going to look more specifically at the case of Ethiopia and also try to pinpoint what are the ways in which aid can better be used in the Horn of Africa. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.